I want to say that in Matthew 27, Judas dies by hanging himself. Yet in Acts 1, it says that he died because like he fell on the ground and basically exploded on the field.
Very good.
So that's just one, but there are other contradictions without both in the New Testament and the Old Testament.
This ex-Christian tries to debunk the Bible, and Cliff Connectly absolutely backfires it. So let's get right into it. Shout out to Cliff Connectly and all the amazing things that he's done. Can't wait to get back. I haven't reacted to one of his videos in a long time. Here we go.
That was like the reliability of the New Testament.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile them?
You bet. You ever tried to hang yourself? I hope not. All right. But guess what? I've had to deal with people who've hanged themselves. It's not easy. When they're successful, they obviously kill themselves. I'll never forget going into the house of one guy who hanged himself with him. And I had to go because I love the guy. And I had to go and see him hanging in the closet where he hanged himself.
Wow.
He didn't want to go. And I don't blame him. It was not a pretty sight. Sir, I can promise you, there's absolutely no contradiction between Judas hanging himself and Judas probably not doing a very good job of it, and the rope breaking or slipping, or the knot slipping, and he falls down, and he bursts open his bowels, and everything falls out. There's no contradiction there.
Well, that's never mentioned though, explicitly.
Sir, every historical record is a partial record of what...
Yeah, and also think about it like this. Someone wrote about how they found the body, and then another one wrote how the person died. Both can be still true at the same time. But this guy continues to just nitpick at the tiny little things, and it really fails.
Happened. Do you think that the book, The Day Lincoln Was Shot, contains every detail of Lincoln's last 24 hours? It's a big book, though. Contains a lot of details. I hope you're not naive enough to think every detail of Lincoln's last day of living is recorded in that book. Sir, there is no history book that includes every detail of what happened. It's impossible to do that.
I can see how if you blend the logic a little bit, it makes sense. However, there are other like accounted records of like, for example, Matthew and Luke have a different genealogy from the birth of like David.
Yeah.
Jesus is supposed to be the seed of David. There's a different genealogy found on both books.
Yep.
So again, how do you reconcile those two facts?
Well, first of all, sir, I disagree strongly with you saying that I bent logic.
Okay, we can agree to disagree.
All right, then if you haven't gotten the point, let's make it real simple. Two guys walking down this road. There's a scream. And then they hit each other. You tell the police, officer, I saw the two people coming down the street. I heard a scream, and then there was a collision. I say, officer, I saw the two guys coming down the street, and there was a screech of sneakers on the yellow brick road. And then there was a collision. Are you and I contradicting each other?
In the book of Acts, it does mention that the way that Judas died was not by himself. It was that he fell and his guts burst open. There is never a mention of a hanging. If there had been a mention of an attempt, I can see how you can make the two stories connect. However, there is never that kind of connection. You have to infer and like add on to it through logical reasoning, as you call it, in order to make the stories connect. But that's never actually mentioned.
Why does it matter though? Like one way or another, that's not even a big detail. Second of all, if there's two different writings, they're always going to have different accounts. But the same thing happens. What was the reality? Judas died. That's the reality. How exactly it happened is a little bit different, but they both could have happened.
If I'm not mistaken, also like in the Old Testament, there's a story of a king. I forget his name, but in one of the books, it says that he was crowned at 18. In another, it says that he was crowned at 8. So again, like there are logical inconsistencies throughout the Bible.
All right, well, I don't know of that one, so please find it and show it to me. I'd love to see it, okay?
Will do.
The genealogies in Matthew and Luke.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so it's a problem. It's a textual problem. The way I think it through is, Luke writes, Jesus was the son, so it was thought, of Joseph. But obviously, one of the main points of Luke is, no, Jesus was not the son of Joseph. He was the son of Mary, who was a virgin. So Joseph was not the daddy. Which means it's very possible that the genealogy of Jesus in Luke is really Mary's genealogy, Because Luke wants to show that Jesus was in the line of David, the Davidic king. Matthew being a...
And I've also heard that in one of the genealogies, the number 7 was super important, and each word a significant importance to show like he is part of the genealogy of David, and that's what they were trying to show for writing to people in Israel.
Is more concerned about the male line, and so he gives the line of Joseph. That is a very real possibility.
2 Chronicles 36:9, Jehoiakim is crowned at 18, and then in 2 Kings 24:8, Jehoiakim is crowned at 18. Crowned at 8 in Chronicles as opposed to crowned at 18 in Kings.
Yeah, you're gonna have to pull that out. I'll have to see context and everything.
For sure. But I guess in the meantime...
so all these contradictions, though, have been talked about for the last 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And never have one time atheist scholars landed on one and said, we're taking this to the bank. It's even a Bart Ehrman, for example, who's the most well-known atheist New Testament scholar today. He'll blast away at, did Mark, for example, talk about Jesus as the Son of God? But never do these scholars, which, no, I respect that you're doing it, never do they hang on to this specific contradiction discredits the reliability of the Gospels. That's not where the argument is today. And the corroboration that goes on from different perspectives, like with the illustration he used with the car accident, that only gives credence and reliability to what occurred. Because if you have exact, from different voices saying exactly, it was 18 years old in exactly this way, with the exact same commas in place, the exact same variants in place, you start to wonder, wow, how many of these guys got together and said, let's go ahead and have a type of collusion and say, this is how it happened. For example, the amount of angels to the tomb. Many people would say, oh, it's a contradiction. There's a contradiction. You know, one gospel writer says it's this many. Another says this many. No, people were there at different times.
You could say the same thing about King David. King David was crowned 3 times. Oh, that's a contradiction. No, he just was an anointed with oil. It's just 3 different events. How do you know he wasn't crowned at 8 when he became the official ruler because his parents passed away? And then when he was 18, maybe an official adult, they crowned him again. Why does it matter?
Some saw 1 angel and some saw 2. And so there's never a contradiction. It always actually gives even more evidence for the reliability of.
In the modern day, we don't account for a king being ascribed or crowned at a specific age, and then later on another book will write in a different age. I don't think like historical conclusions should be made off of like the irrespectiveness of like 2 opinions. I guess it makes sense when it comes to like first person narratives, but like historical records, at least they should usually be exactly the same because they are, again, like historical account of a specific like ruler.
There are so many inconsistencies across the board. It is so hard to pull up a document from thousands of years old and try and put it into a certain box and say, all 5 of you must say that this was the exact age at the exact time in the exact place. Because the odd thing about it is you go over to Israel and you talk to any tour guide, Christian or non-Christian, they will be opening their Bible, typically in the 13 epistles that Paul wrote, and they will be watching where Paul traveled to show you exactly where we will travel. And the only reason why we know of these places is because of what Paul wrote and Luke wrote.
Right, and then what he's saying is, I have it here, 2 Kings 22 verse 1 and 2 Chronicles 34 verse 1, both stating that he began to reign at 8 and reigned 31 years. So what is he talking about for Josiah?
The archaeology and the historicity of what the Bible talks about is bar none in greatness compared to any other ancient text we have. Yeah?
Most scholars don't agree that the writers or the title of a book is the actual person that wrote that book. That is a Christian tradition, but that most scholars...
First of all, that's not true, percentage-wise. Some do. What is the evidence that it was those writers, for example?
Well, okay.
Well, the dating of the book we have, and if you have the dating of the book, which is what consensus scholarship talks about, that's the most important thing. Most likely, you have the names correct, scholars would say, if you have the dating correct. We have the dating correct on the Gospels, so most likely, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which were the names that were typically most used in that day and age, so it kind of makes sense. If it was, what's your name?
Yanni.
If it was Yanni, most likely that would have been made up. But these were consistent names. Now, the strange part about it was, yes, one was a doctor, the rest were fishermen who had very little knowledge. And so that God was able to use them to get a message across was pretty impressive.
I don't know about Luke. I don't think he was a fisherman. I'm pretty sure he was the traveling companion with Paul, but Mark probably was with, well, maybe Mark was with Jesus. I mean, Mark was with Peter, and maybe he was a fisherman. I don't know. I mean, Matthew was a tax collector, so he's a little off there, but...
Even if the names were different, in no way does that completely discredit what was being written. Because within the Gospels themselves, archaeology not only incredibly consistent, but so much more expansive than any other ancient document we have to date, it's scary. Names consistent. Locations in terms of describing, was Capernaum to the west or to the south? Which direction was it? Cubits in terms of the measurements of certain things. That is very impressive. Or example, sycamore trees, olive trees, all in the perfect locale and geography of where they exist even today. Remember old Zacchaeus, little Zacchaeus climbing up in a sycamore tree? That is perfectly fits where the locale was of where Jesus met.
I don't disagree. However, I disagree with the idea that like Mark wrote Mark, or that like Matthew wrote Matthew. 90% of Matthew is found in Mark, word for word, like verbatim, which leads scholars to the conclusion that what most likely happened was that Matthew wrote Matthew based off Mark.
Yeah.
And never does the author actually call himself Matthew. Never.
But what's the problem? Who cares? Even if he was copying, they just used sources. They used references. They interviewed eyewitnesses and people during that time. I don't get the problem.
Like the author of Mark ever call himself Mark.
And you're even referring to another source, which most likely Matthew, Mark, and Luke, not John, also borrowed off of.
Yes.
Yes, Matthew and Luke most likely borrowed from Mark, which was the earliest written document. What is wrong with that?
That like these specific writers, by name and title, wrote these specific books.
Yeah, they did. From different directions, different point of views. Matthew, for example, was a Jew, focused on a very Jewish perspective. That's why he starts off with a lineage in Matthew chapter 1 that's focused on Jewish figures, like King David, for example. So note, it's perfectly in place that they got the central message in total agreement, and yet there were different angles in terms of their own background and how they would have talked about it. Luke, being a Gentile, very different in focus, and talking to Theophilus, who would have been a very wealthy man, as well as one who was a skeptic like you, strong skeptic, wouldn't have believed this message. And yet he says, "Dear Theophilus, here's the evidence, here's the record that I've taken. You choose for yourself. I'm not going to brainwash you into it. You decide whether the evidence stacks up or not, on whether Jesus actually is the Son of God, and actually whether he rose from the dead or not."
I'm just arguing against like utilizing scripture like infallibly. I don't disagree that like but
What's your definition of infallibility?
infallibility?
Yep.
That like we can utilize scripture word for word to like account for any aspect of our lives. For example, the idea that like homosexuality should be yes a sin just because like certain books say that. I believe
That's what it really comes down to. They just get upset because certain things in the Bible they don't like. And then they're like, well, there's other contradictions other places. How do you know we could even trust this? I want to do what I want to do because I want to be my own God.
like a lot of historical nuances that we should give to scripture
Sure.
and give scripture grace.
Sure.
Yeah.
So a holy kiss. I'm not going to come over and kiss you right now. But
No,
Paul talked
I
about two men giving a holy kiss. There was no holy kiss going on in other religions or worldviews. That was a type of intimacy shown between men, not from a homosexual perspective, but it's not used today. But I respect if Christians go around a holy kiss on the cheek with each other. So you're exactly right. There are going to be passages of scripture that are not going to apply to us today. Now we have to work out contextually whether that we should be applying it or not. So for example, head coverings for women. Should all women wear head coverings when going to church? You got to look at the context and you got to be honest. You can't just come in and say, that's a tough teaching. You know what? Let's get rid of that one. So a lot of atheists will say, that's what Christians do. Okay, some Christians may. I sure hope not, though, because there's something called context is king. So every single time in seminary, when I would study Greek and Hebrew, we had to look at context. We never went to a passage of scripture and said, this would help our atheist friends become Christians if we just smooth this over.
Right.
No, there's difficult teachings in the Bible, and wouldn't you expect, if God really existed and truly wrote us a book that was trying to get a message to us to believe in him,
wouldn't you think there would be parts of that book that would agree with us greatly, our very minds and hearts, but that would also disagree with us in our cultural context at times and call us to accountability to change in certain areas? I don't think you want a book that just agrees with every single desire that you have. And I don't think you want a book either from this God, supposedly, that's going to disagree with every single desire you have. You're doing this whole jumping kind of machine gun style approach, which is question, 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 and calling it an intellectual kind of evidentiary type of logic and thinking. I don't think it is. People like you who I've encountered for years and years and years, for him over 40 years, it's always more of an emotional issue. I mean,
Exactly. He doesn't really care about these inconsistencies. He doesn't really care about those, but he just cares about how the Bible tells him how to live, and he's upset with that. And that's mainly the biggest problem. Even all the intellectuals won't admit this, but that's the biggest problem. They don't want to submit to authority. They want to be their own God.
Christianity was true, would you become a Christian?
If it was true and there was like, well, I'm not saying that I'm not a Christian.
Okay.
I think it's, I don't know why you keep like surmounting me with like atheist or some stuff like that.
Well, what are you? I don't know what you are.
A Christian leading agnostic.
A Christian leading agnostic. What does that mean?
Culturally raised Christian, right?
Okay.
Studied scripture growing up, but like now I have certain doubts and issues that I'm trying to sort out.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm presenting them to you guys.
Yeah. So I don't know why you have to throw the agnostic term in there.
Right.
How about just a Christian who has problems with certain parts of scripture or with certain parts of what God tells you have to live in a certain type of lifestyle, that you have doubts that are not leading you to cynicism or a certain type of closed offness, but doubts that are leading you hopefully to grow in understanding the truth.
Because I don't know if God is real.
Okay?
Yeah.
Why do you doubt that God is real?
Well,
What is your evidence that God is not real?
if God is omnibenign and omnibenevolent and omniscient and omnipowerful, how come there are certain parts of scripture where God literally commands his people to commit genocide against
See?
women, children, and infants? Let's look at the book of, if I'm not mistaken, 1st of Samuel, chapter 15, if I'm not wrong, where
David
God
Goliath.
sends a group of people of Israel to end or bring death to the Amalekites. And he literally commands, word for word, to bring death to men, women, children, and infants. And a bunch of other cattle and other stuff.
Yeah.
But like, if God is omnibenevolent, why would he do that?
If you go to the Near East today, they will not have problems, typically the majority of them, with that text. They will have the opposite end of the problem, which is, your God is a gracious God? Your God actually died for you, for his enemies? That's weird, because it's a shame and honor culture. So you're being heavily influenced by your Western cultural sensibilities to even ask that question. 1. 2, if you would have been in the ancient Near Eastern culture, that would have been very normal. And some would have even said that would have been more gracious than have letting them live, because they would have been sold into prostitution. The families would have been totally divided, never seeing each other yet again, and ended up many of the kids in slavery. Now, it's still a difficult passage. I'm not going to stand here and be like, oh, come on, that's easy. Thirdly, though, it was not genocide. Genocide is the implication of wiping out an entire people group completely. The Amalekites pop up later on in the Bible. So many of them were judged, yes, and justice fell on them, and yet many pop up later on. So it was not this type of ethnocentrism, which was, hey, the Jews are the chosen people. The Jews are always going to be the crown people group, and they're just going around committing genocide. No, they never commit full genocide. There absolutely is judgment. These other people groups pop up later on. I'm glad you brought this passage up, though, because yet again, this is the greatest example that I know of in an ancient Near Eastern type of text showing God's grace and forgiveness.
So what you're
Why? 400 years. God says, I do not want the Amalekites to perish. I do not want them to perish. I want them to change. I want them to change their bestiality. I want them to change their infanticide, their patricide, and come to actually know me. 400 years. They were getting consistent warnings from prophets. And then finally God said, I'm going to lead them over to their own desires. And what their own desires are going to ultimately lead to is judgment.
God,
Everyone's like, if God was all loving, why did he allow all these bad things to happen? And then when he does something to get them to stop living that way, which sometimes probably ends in death because of that's the only way you can stop someone, then they're like, why did God do all those bad things to those bad people? Like, it's a never-ending emotional problem.
have to bring death to children and infants. Omnipowerful
They were
God.
putting their own babies on top of molten hot magma and getting taken out of the cities because their babies were screaming so loudly.
Right.
So they were aborting not only abortion, that was very dangerous in that day and age, but it was actually infanticide. Their own babies, almost every family was, in order to honor the gods. So I don't know what your big problem is, ultimately, where God, after 400 years, comes in and judges, wipes them away. And secondly, how in the world do you think that those babies or those mothers are not in heaven right now? Just because it's a finite judgment does not in any kind of way mean it's an eternal judgment. I mean, the baby born out of great sin from David and Bathsheba, what does the text say there? It says that David will not have the baby come to him, but he will go to the baby. Well, that baby is born out of murder and adultery. Definitely not any type of Christian faith. And yet the text says that baby is going to be in heaven. So careful thinking about, yes, there's absolutely judgment on this planet and punishment, especially in the Old Testament, but that doesn't mean those people are not going to be in heaven for eternity.
Right. He still judges Israel. He judged Israel and had them getting taken out to Babylon. Like, what is going on? They don't seem to get upset when God judges Israel. He handed them over there. So I think this is also fascinating. And shout out to Cliff and Stuart for giving an answer to all these objections. I would love to know what you think in the comments down below, whatever that may be. And also, guys, I have another channel you can check out and subscribe. I'm trying to get that to 1,000 subscribers. That would mean the world if you could subscribe. And have an amazing day, guys.